Welcome back to Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth. My name is Tom, and I'll be your guide as we spend this episode exploring Chapter 15 of Wizard's First Rule. In our last episode, Chase takes Richard to the boundary to show him what's what, before a beast from inside attacks and knocks all of them out. Please note, these episodes contain spoilers, heavy spoilers, not just for this chapter, but for future chapters and books in the series. If you haven't read the series yet and you intend to, I'd encourage you to read the books first, and then come back and see what I think about them. Spoiler alert, I look at these characters differently every time I see them. At the beginning of this chapter, best estimates place the time since the beginning of Wizard's First Rule on the evening of the 6th day. We begin the chapter with a high-speed chase as a bloodthirsty pack of hearthounds chasing Chase, Richard, Kahlan, and Zed. The warden and the wizard are unconscious, and Richard knows if they stop, they are dead. The horses are frightened and have chosen to run. Their riders don't argue with them either. The howls of the hearthounds energize their effort. There is water and mud created by the thin gray clouds, somewhat heavy with rain, which the wizard had summoned to hide Darkenrall's tracer to Richard, his magical ball and chain. Previous chapters, which covered strong instinctive responses from the body, resulting in a choice of fight or flee, the option has been to fight. This is not to be confused with the reasoned decision to leave Zed's house or Richard's house while Darkenrall was there. Both of those choices were thought out and premeditated. All of the other major snap decisions regarding danger were met with a fight response or some other call to action. In an article for Domios.com titled Boxers, How to Get Over the Fear of Getting Hit, Gianni Randazzo, a 10-year veteran boxer and coach, says, "I needed to know what to do. How should I react to an attack, my opponent's movement, or even a hit that hurts?" He says, "I've learned to control my attitude and gaze even if I get hit. I let nothing show. This way of managing the attack or fight lets you stand up to your opponent, but also, of course, requires technique." What he is talking about is a common form of training, not only to boxers, but to many other martial artists as well. In fighting, the instincts are too primitive to allow for someone to effectively combat someone else who has training and experience, and knows when those instincts are giving them good advice, and when those instincts are giving them bad advice. The point is, instincts are fine and useful in many situations, but in many situations are not sufficient to produce a guarantee of success. They're just the body's way of recognizing a threat and telling you to do something. Instinct doesn't give any advice on what the right thing to do is, just a warning that doing nothing might not be wise. But as we have seen in previous chapters with many interpersonal reactions, sometimes doing nothing when instinct says you should really do something is the best of course of action. The way to test if any of that makes sense is to ask yourself if you've ever seen someone in a tense situation that was about to resolve itself, and all the person stuck in the middle of it had to do is not say anything, make it worse by saying something. Have you ever asked someone in your mind to just be quiet because the problem will actually go away if they're able to let go of it? That's what I'm talking about here. The desire to fight back can lead a person to pick aggression, when the person they choose to need to fight may have them at an extreme disadvantage for either power, skill, or both. While that might seem obvious, it doesn't stop people from trying. Wile E. Coyote has been trying to get the Roadrunner for decades now, and anvils falling on his head and the 1,000-foot drops don't seem to bother him enough to make him choose store-bought Roadrunner meat instead. The sentence at the end of the first paragraph of the chapter shows cause and effect relationship. When the hearthounds shrieked, the horses returned a snort of fear. The assault on the senses provokes a fight or flight response in those horses, in the same way that a challenge to someone we believe triggers a fight or flight response in us. I'll use an example that is obvious, much like Zed does with Richard when playing What If about the gambit moth in the spirit house. Have you ever seen a person screaming words at another person? Did you feel bad for the person getting yelled at? While some are natural peacemakers and would choose to put ourselves willingly in an emotionally charged situation, intellectually it's not difficult to understand, regardless of what your decision would be in that scenario. Despite the good intentions of many, observing such a strong emotional display triggers a decision to avoid the thing they are directly not involved with and would steer clear of someone who's getting yelling at. even if they feel poorly for the person who is at the receiving end of the verbal abuse. Their feelings of justice aren't strong enough to overcome the advice from their instincts, which is to avoid the bad situation someone else is already in the middle of. The examples of this are all around us, and most of the time they aren't really dramatic enough to stand out. Information from those who are using words to try and force a decision from others without asking for it. Both groups are thrown into a cycle of creating and reacting to a self-sustaining series of fight or flight responses. That is, responding to a challenge which makes them choose to fight back or disengage. They create a challenge which another person will choose to fight back against or disengage from. The interaction only succeeds in reinforcing the original belief so deeply that it becomes impossible for people on either side to see that some people do have a problem with other people based on the color of their skin. And others are unable to see that some of these people aren't doing themselves any favors by engaging in activities such as looting or burning, which would be used as evidence to defend those deeply ingrained but prejudiced and wrong beliefs. Anyone who hasn't taken a side so deeply that they're still able to understand without necessarily agreeing a point of view which is different from one will understand how both sides of this argument are just not making sense to the different people who are having them. And the best evidence of this lack of ability to understand and empathize with another point of view, even for the sake of argument, is the creation of the Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter conversation. If you or a loved one experienced strong reactions to points of view which are presented in contradictions with their own point of view, I warn you to turn away for the next 90 seconds or so. With one finger in each ear, the chorus to "I Will Survive" should be long enough to drown out any opinion which may trigger a fight or flight response, as I say once and for all who is right and who is wrong while debating the phrases Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. The most common occurrence of the fight or flight instinct comes when information is presented which is different from information a person already believes to be true. A good example of this would be on social media. Some people get this fight or flight instinct by poor grammar or spelling. Others have it triggered when a certain word or phrase is used, and while the meaning of that word or phrase is perfectly understood, because that word or phrase carries additional meanings of connotation for the individual, which were never intended by the person using it, there is a triggering of the fight instinct. Most recently in modern politics, you see this with the language of argument surrounding Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. Normally, I don't get involved with political conversations without making sure the person is looking for a conversation and not an excuse to hear why they're right and why everyone else is wrong. But I am going to weigh in on this one. Well, a group of people were hurting because they weren't feeling heard. Connections and collections of those people gathered together to make themselves heard by strength in numbers. Some of those people recognized the truth that it is impossible to use loud words and shouting to change the heart and mind of another person. Mistaking a problem with technique for a problem with volume, some of those people tried to make themselves louder by lighting things on fire, taking things that didn't belong to them and breaking things which other people owned. Others who agree that it is a good thing for everyone to be able to speak and be heard disapprove of the attempted use of force to take from others, which is a decision they must make on their own. Those people are unable to separate those who are trying to be heard and are using their words properly for their intended purpose of conveying their point of view from the people who are causing destruction. They get lumped in together because of association. So what is the answer to this? The answer is, at least for the problem I am looking at, I have never seen a more asinine, misguided, self-destructive, counterproductive type of argument in my entire life. People are literally arguing over how to best treat human beings equally by separating them into two groups based on which collections of words and syllables they use to describe how they want all human beings to be treated equally. That is what everybody is saying they want, right? That was my takeaway. Every human being involved in this pointless argument, when asked if they want every human being to be given the choices which depend more on the effort of the individual and less on what group that human being belongs to, I haven't found one person who will tell me to my face that they wouldn't want a world where the only group of people which mattered when someone is being treated a certain way is the fact that they are a human being. And I have seen some of the most aggressive, bullying behavior in my entire life centered around this argument from people on both sides. If you have ever wondered if the people you agree with ideologically are everything they're cracked up to be, do a little experiment for yourself. Go to a place where people normally agree with you politically and try telling a few of them that what they're saying doesn't make sense. The only rule to this experiment is when given a response, you disagree with them. You can be as respectful or as mean as you normally are, and the only rule you tell them is you don't think they're right. See what kind of reaction you get and ask yourself if you think it's fair of you to be treated that way just for having a difference of opinion than someone else. The only thing that's even close to this is like people fighting over Merry Christmas versus Happy Holidays, except in this example, more people mean it and less people see the lunacy of fighting over the words to say before you're allowed to help other people. And guess what? While you're doing that, those people are getting no help. This isn't Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. When did they start putting passcodes on trying to do the right thing? If every one of those soldiers of semantics went outside and picked up one piece of trash instead of fighting other people who use different words to say the same thing they're trying to say, the world would be a better place. And I don't buy it when someone uses their words to say one thing and their actions to do another. All of it, every bit of it, comes from the person listening to their cognitive dissonance instead of their rational mind. The signal dissonance gives, it's fight or flight. Every time the mind processes information which goes against what they already believe, this is what happens. The entire idea of that is wrapped up in the phrase, the hounds howled and the horses were energized by their howls. Have you ever had a moment of clarity where you stepped back and wondered, what's the point of all the political fighting since nothing ever really changes? That is what this part of the chapter is talking about. In that moment, you recognize, even if it's briefly, that no one is making rational choices and the whole damn thing is feeding off of itself. The body produces a fight or flight response and blindly following it and using the mind to come up with 1,000 reasons why one way of wishing a human being were treated better is a justification for treating another human being worse. That is how we end up in situations like this. Recognizing what is happening is the only way to change it, because once a person can see the choice, then making a different choice besides fighting or disengaging becomes possible, which is good because sometimes the other two options both suck. Why not try the option that lets people feel heard, all of them, instead of just the ones that agree with you? You might find that when you get that from other people, things can actually change. Richard lets Kahlan's horse run in front because he wants to stay between her and the hardhounds. Richard wishes he could turn away from the path leading them to the pass because the hounds are coming in fast and Richard knows he won't be able to outrun them for very long. Richard believes the best course of action is to stick to the path and try to make it to the swamp Chase was talking about before he was struck down. Richard is unsure how much further it is to safety and that he doesn't know himself if it's going to turn out for good or for bad or what he's going to find when he gets there. He only knows this is his only choice that he has, which he thinks has a chance of succeeding. Symbolically, this is a nod to integrity's responsibility to protect an individual's sense of justice from being taken over by well-intentioned instinct, which would then be used to destroy the free will of a person using it rather than protect it. He knows that his instincts are telling him to cut through the forest as directly as possible to get further away from the boundary, but his reason tells him that the trees and woods are too thick and they wouldn't be able to get very far before being run down and killed. In December of 2020, interweavegold.com released an article titled Competency-Based Interviews 2021, Questions, Answers, Examples, Success Profiles, and the Goal of Shedding Light on some of those qualities. The top-paying companies were screening for some of these qualities while conducting their job interviews. They defined an ability to see the big picture as an indicator of competency. They describe seeing the big picture as being able to look beyond one's own role and tasks with an awareness of how your activities feed into the performance of your team, your department, and the organization. For all staff, it's about focusing on delivering the organization's goals in the most effective and efficient way possible. This quality is also referenced as organizational or strategic awareness or strategic management, and it's all about the person's ability, or more often the willingness, to make a connection between day-to-day tasks and the overall goals of your department and your employer. As discussed in previous chapters, the thick, dense, and dead wooded area is a symbol of all the parts of the mind which have been cluttered or destroyed by specific interactions where a hard line with only two options exists. The instinct is respond to those attacks and ideas which cause us that type of feeling. But those are the weeds and the thick woods we can get lost in. If safety of the mind is a resolution which is good and that's the goal, then sight of the big picture must be maintained at all times. The path is the path, and getting lost in the weeds to pick every battle is a quick back path to sure danger, if not death. The way to understand this topic is ask you if you ever saw someone make the transition from rational to irrational over the period of a short conversation. That transformation usually doesn't take very long, but the difference between before and after is striking. That person chose to engage in something which only served to make them more and more upset, eventually leading to the point where an unbiased view of the world around them was no longer the goal at all. Simply walking away, or refusing to engage, or disengaging would have presented the momentary slip into insanity if they hadn't gotten themselves lost in the weeds over what one person out of 7 billion thought regarding something they felt differently about. And much like Richard, sometimes the path to walking away, to disengaging, or finding the third option, will always be a longer one than leaving the path to try and cut through the woods. But just because it is shorter and easier to do in the moment doesn't mean it's the correct choice. And I bet if I asked anyone if they could come up with an example of how the right choice was a little more work than the easiest choice, there would be no shortage of examples each of us could produce at a whim. As Richard and Kahlan flee the Hearthounds, Richard notices that the day is coming to an end, and it will be nightfall soon. The rain feels cold and sharp on his face. Richard also expresses concern for his friends. He knows being tied to the back of a running horse isn't the best method of transporting someone who is injured. Richard hopes that they'll be okay and wake up soon. Kahlan isn't looking anywhere except straight ahead. She is laser focused on her task of running the horse down the path to safety. Symbolically, this represents an internal damage report after a particularly exhausting battle of wills. Richard, as the representation of integrity, is asking himself, what is left after what just happened? His sense of self is still intact and undamaged, as is his sense of justice. So long as he keeps his sense of justice pointed in the right direction and on the path, it continues to be a source of strength and effectiveness. His self-reliance and pride have been shaken, which makes sense in this situation. They are currently fleeing from a fight that did not go well for them, running from a situation because the decision of powerlessness was made, and that would leave any person feeling shaken and self-conscious. The example I think of when I'm explaining this to myself is that there have been times in my life I can think of where I was on the receiving end of some rather harsh presentations of information. Fighting back wasn't an option, and I didn't recognize my own power to walk away from the situation or find a third option. So mentally, I ran from the confrontation, not from a place of reason, but from a place of fear of what it would feel like if I didn't. And those interactions, I would go over the scene in my head over and over again, trying to play out how I could have better defended myself or handled what was going on around me. My self-confidence and ability to use the talents I had at my disposal was very limited when I was in that state of mind. Have you ever had an interaction with someone else which caused you to step back and you needed to recenter yourself? If you have, then you've already felt a version of what I'm talking about here personally and what I'm talking about here in the story. So you get it. You get it if you felt it, you understand. The road twists and turns until Richard starts noticing fewer and fewer dead trees. The foliage is slowly being replaced with oak, ash, and maple trees, followed quickly by cedar. After a drop in the trail, Richard sees the Sco Swamp. For the purposes of discussing the symbolism of the trees, the author mentions, this presentation has deemed the information contained within the website treesymbolism.com to be sufficiently balanced and unbiased for the purposes of using their symbolism as a tool to explore the ideas presented here. First, the author mentions oak, ash, and maple trees. The oak tree is a symbol of longevity, life, and health, as well as survival. The ash tree represents longevity, good health, stability, and protection. The maple tree is a symbol of longevity, protection, and changes. There are many different trees with many different meanings, and in this situation, the author has chosen to group trees with similar meanings prominently within the words he uses to describe his story. The swamp has always been described as a place of sanctuary from the hearthounds, and the change in scenery is meant to show the strength and life of a healthy mind when a choice exists to follow or not follow instinct for whatever reason it deems fit. The cedar trees are a bit more specialized than the ones encountered before it. Strength, support, connection, purification, and protection are all symbols commonly tied to cedar trees. Do you have a place in your life where you set aside to get away from all the conflict and stress of the world? The presentation of what this place is different for many people. For some, it's a long shower. For others, it could be meditations. For some, it's the act of enjoying a sporting event in peace or the practice of martial arts. Sometimes a few minutes in a quiet room or a cell phone call to a cherished loved one is what other people might use. There is also something to be said for the company of a good book. If you have a place you like to go when you need to decompress for the day, then you understand what the author is trying to do with the symbolism of these trees. Every time I read the chapter about the Sco Swamp, I always imagined it to be a dingy and dangerous place full of monsters and threats. It wasn't until I was researching this chapter for the series that I begun to reevaluate my position. All of the symbolism points to strength, growth, and an abundance of life. Take the thitty wook We're going to do that one again. Take two. Take the thick woody vines growing all over everything, please. At first I thought they were giving the trees and plants around them no respect. No respect at all. That was until I looked up the symbolism of the vines and saw them from a much different perspective than the one I had before. A perspective that made me sense more than what I saw before. Because the vines were able to grow and thrive almost anywhere there is life, they are symbols of determination, the will to survive against all odds, and the will to make connections. Their ability to hold on to anything is symbolic of holding on to a core value so tightly and building connections around it, such as my own tendency to place the right of consent in the hands of the individual, regardless of their ability to see their own ownership of it in a given situation. They are also symbolic of connection and the expansion of knowledge as new directions of thought are pursued to explore better ideas than the ones currently being held as true. The vines are not symbolically oppressive. They are a healthy habit within a healthy mind. They represent the ability of a person to root themselves in one core idea and step aside from that idea and see what sort of connections are formed when that idea is viewed from multiple points of view. This is also the symbolism behind the phrase, everything seemed to be growing on top of something else, seeking to gain an advantage. That isn't a snuffing out or an oppression of life, which would be impossible to argue in a place with so much life living together in a single spot. This is a symbolic of the mind where ideas are given free rein to be explored from as many points of view as the person has time to gather and explore. The ideas are combined, they meld, they interact. Sometimes a new perspective will cause old information to become obsolete, such as my opinion that the swamp was a place of dreariness and fear. But symbolically speaking, that evolution of an idea is not a failure. It's just a better picture of something I was looking at from the wrong point of view. And having a better picture of something is always a good thing. The difference is the person recognizes it and chooses to act according to reason, rather than from a notion that all their own ideas and opinions must be defended to the death. Everything in the swamp is described as having adapted to survive and thrive. Nothing in the swamp exists or insists upon itself as constant. They all live and work together to make life here into what it is, and it's all bunched together and connected. The example to explain this concept is a very simple one. For the sake of argument, I'll assume most of my viewers are capable of what I'm about to say. Have you ever learned something new which surprised you? Something which completely and totally upended something you previously believed. It doesn't have to be a life-changing revelation. It could be something as simple as evidence popping up which makes a previously held opinion impossible to hold on to. Like learning a car you like comes in a color which you previously thought was never an option. Or learning about a skill or education a close friend has always possessed, but you're learning about for the first time. In each of those situations, information is received with an open mind, and a decision is made to keep the information which remains consistent with the truth and remove the information which does not. That is what the author is describing in this swamp. It's a healthy place, full of life. It's not a simple place, nor does it allow for the cultivation of anything which is not consistent with all of the other life present. Richard notices that the trail is barely above the water to the swamp. The Hearthounds are still attempting to chase them. Richard sees his only chance at survival is to cross the water and go to a nearby small island in the center, poking up just above the water's surface. Richard points at the island and says he isn't sure, but that's where they need to go to remain safe. Kahlan doesn't hesitate and follows his direction immediately. As Kahlan goes through the water, we learn it's only 3 or 4 feet deep. Kahlan is focused on what is ahead of her. Richard is paying more and more attention, scanning for threats, and he sees large brown snakes with copper-colored splotches on their back, which are swimming around them under the surface of the water. Richard realizes they aren't going to make it to the island in time before the snakes reach them. Richard has never seen snakes this big before, and he sees a lot of them, and they're coming right for him. He gets the sword of truth ready to use against one of them, and the first one gets too close, but as soon as the tip of the sword touches the water, the magic of the sword makes the snakes swim away. There were a wide variety of water snakes to explore while I was trying to figure out what kind of snake Goodkind was referring to. I've narrowed the list of prime suspects down to the cottonmouth water snake, the copperhead, and the northern water snake. The reasoning being, while all three can have different characteristics, they were similar enough that I should explore each one. I have narrowed down this list by the process of elimination. Using the knowledge of the author's writing style, I have yet to see him miss an opportunity to make a situation more dangerous by simply describing the different forms of danger that are there. And while all three of the characteristics match the snakes in certain circumstances, the cottonmouth and the copperhead are venomous, and the northern water snake is not. Poison dripping from fangs would be too powerful an image for him to resist. But beyond that, the most compelling evidence is the symbolism doesn't fit the rest of the scene unless the snake is not venomous. Or unless, if the snake is venomous, if the snake has no venom, so there's no snake in the venom, and there's no venom in the snake, cha-cha-cha-cha. So because the snake has no venom, when a snake does not have venom, that is what makes it matter. When exploring the symbolisms of snakes, I stumbled across an article written by the Center for the New Age in Sedona, Arizona, titled, "What is the Symbolism of Snakes?" While I did not research their organization for the integrity of their core message, I was satisfied that their research on the symbolism of snakes was useful and sound. The article references historical references of snakes standing for fertility and creativity. They are also symbols of rebirth, transformation, immortality, and healing. The Ouroboros, an ancient symbol of the serpent eating its own tail, is a symbol of eternity and the continued renewal of life. Additionally, snakes have been associated with all sorts of the oldest rituals known to mankind and represent the dual expression of good and evil. That is why the snakes swim away from the sword of truth when it is in the water with them. The snakes are a symbol for healing and the rebirth of the mind. True mental healing comes from finding the truth at the root of a problem and making peace with all sides of the conflict causing the mental trauma. For this to work at all, the truth is the only thing capable of granting this type of lasting mental health. The snakes aren't a symbolic threat to that which is good for the mind. They're only dangerous to untruths, half-truths, fallacies of consent, which present at the root of mental pain. Which brings me to a point where it isn't unusual for me to lose some people. This part is where people confuse a physical predisposition to be vulnerable to certain types of mental pain, like myself, who has anxiety, depression, and a host of a few other sensory and social disorders. Needless to say, viewing these things from an interior perspective is something I am very well familiar with and have struggled to overcome and complete that part of myself for quite some time. Mental pain is the result of the self hurting the self. There are stacks of papers listing biology and psychology and other things, all of which prove a relationship between certain types of brain chemistry and physical predisposition to certain types of behavior. All of those studies are true and outline specific cause and effect relationships. None of those studies ever claim that biology has the ability to go inside another person's head and hijack their motor controls, causing them to murder, rape, yell, cry, scream, jump up and down, cheat on their wife, gamble away a life savings. The only thing they say is the same thing that I will say. There is a physical condition which makes those feelings present more strongly than they present in other people. The self-destructive and misleading instincts are more prevalent, but reasoning is unaffected. The mind is still the same intellect and has the same limitations absent this physical predisposition. The choice of how to respond to those impulses still belongs to them. They can wake up, they can go to bed, they can have a hamburger, they can try to eat healthy, they can exercise, they can go on a rampage, they could cry in a corner. But those aren't things that are totally out of their control. Those are choices they make to try and help themselves deal with what they're going through. They think it's going to help, or at least it feels like it's going to help. If that concept causes some people to struggle, you aren't alone. And speaking from an insider's point of view, as someone who was on medication for quite a time due to severe anxiety and depression, the walls of that prison feel impenetrable. That helped my physical predisposition to experience the impulses so strongly, but did nothing to attack the root cause of my mental pain. So the medicine made my impulses weaker, but they didn't cause what was causing the impulses to stop. Most medication for chemical imbalance is also prescribed along therapy sessions to discuss the root causes driving the issue, right? Therapists don't do anything except help a person go over the information they have and help the patient use that information to make themselves feel better. They are mental guides. They're trying to lead people to the decision that they have the power to feel better about the things which are causing them problems. They don't pretend that the problems go away. They only say that you have the power to feel a little better about it. Therapists don't ever go out and kneecap the rude cashier at Whole Foods who publicly humiliated them and when they wouldn't give $1 to charity. They just talk about how that made them feel and why. They use reason in a safe setting to help a person navigate back to the moment of runaway emotional self-destruction and help them use their reason to find a different path which doesn't make them feel like their only choices are to fight or run when reality has repeatedly told them that both of those choices are bad ones. The snakes represent the desire of the defense against that which is false in the mind. So symbolically, the snakes have no interest in harming that which is true and good within the rational mind. While Richard and Kahlan are crossing the river, the Heart Hounds make it to the spot where they left the trail. The hounds look like they want to enter the water, but they don't. They growl and snarl and said, "As long as the sword tip is in the water, the snakes stay away and they make it to the island, surrounded by cedars, poplar tree, and iris flowers. Richard is relieved when none of the snakes follow them onto dry land." The trees and foliage on the island also share appropriate symbolism for people seeking shelter from bloodthirsty predators. Poplar trees are symbolic of protection, courage, heroism, and success, and the iris flowers are commonly used to represent faith, hope, wisdom, and valor. If we continue the analogy of the mind trying to heal itself after a particularly damaging encounter, the best place to do that would be an island of thoughts centered around hope, wisdom, courage, success, and protection, surrounded by a moat filled with snakes which attack anything that is not useful for healing, rebirth, and transformation. Richard uses a tarp to make a shelter to keep the rain out. The swamp and the rain make starting a fire impossible. Richard settles for a couple of candles to provide some light. Both of them are worried about Zed and Chase. Neither one of them knows what to do to help them. Richard says their best option is to make it to South Haven and see if they can find a healer there. He also decides it would be wise to build a litter to drag his friends along the ground so they won't be bounced around riding the way they were before. Both of them wrap their injured friends up in some blankets while they sit together sharing the candlelight. They can see pairs of glowing yellow eyes staring back at them through the trail. The hounds are looking for a way to get to them, but are unable to do much besides get frustrated by their own impotence. Kahlan still isn't sure why the Hearthounds haven't followed them and says, "Richard, I can't believe the Hearthounds haven't followed us." And Richard says, "Kahlan, you aren't going to believe this, but I think they didn't follow us because of the snakes in the water." In an article written in 2009 by thebark.com covering canine eye disorders, the phenomenon of what makes an eye's glow in the dark is explained. Dogs have a membrane which acts like a third eyelid to protect the eye. It's called the tapetum lucidum. It's a reflective lining behind the retina. This lining is what makes dogs' eyes glow when the lights hit them. The tapetum lucidum engages and enables dogs to see in dimmer light than they would otherwise be possible. So they can see better at night than we can. And that's what that science thing means. Kahlan, who never even saw any snakes, says that she never even saw any snakes. Then she does her best Indiana Jones impersonation when she tells Richard she doesn't like snakes. Richard says the snakes don't seem to be the problem so long as the sword of truth is in the water, and he doesn't think the snakes will be causing them any harm. Kahlan isn't satisfied with the answer and tells him she would have liked to have known about the snakes that were crossing the water instead of finding out about them afterwards. Richard reminds her that they had bigger fish to fry just then, and making her scared of the snakes would have been counterproductive, especially since he seemed to have them under control with the sword. How do all of you feel about snakes? I don't mind the ones without the poison in them so much. The author's choice to give Kahlan a mild phobia of snakes does a lot to get her character more depth, and adds more drama to her interaction with Shota in chapter 30, when the witch woman covers Kahlan with snakes. Symbolically, a phobia of snakes fits well with Kahlan's representation as the symbol for justice. Think back to Kahlan's behavior in the last chapter. Richard pulled her from the edge of the boundary, and immediately after she was safe, she tried to rush back in to look for Zed and Chase. Both the attack and her eagerness to rush back towards the boundary are what it's like when a person's sense of justice gets the best of them. It's the heart of the wizard's first rule. The best intentions make it so that we will believe a lie, even though we can prove it's false. We just don't hear it. And that leads us to break the wizard's second rule. The best of intentions can result in the greatest harm. And justice is a common path to well-intentioned but destructive behavior. The symbolic island of self-reflection and mental healing is a place where only the truth can live. Justice is a powerful feeling, and in the right hands it can be a force for good, which defends the right of others to live as they see fit. The only rule is that freedom only goes so far as to what another person is willing to give of themselves willingly. When justice is used to take from someone and is used to justify hurting someone on behalf of another for a supposed greater good, then it ceases to be justice and becomes tyranny. And I have never seen someone who was hurting another person for their version of the greater good who didn't feel completely justified in their decision. It's a wizard's second rule, indeed. Kahlan's aversion to snakes is a reference for how easy it can be to allow our own sense of justice to believe a lie or behaved in ways which would appear awful if they weren't somehow noble because of the means they have attached to those actions. And somehow that makes that awful behavior towards another human being seem righteous instead. It's insanity. The best way to understand this concept is to ask yourself if you can think of a time when you saw one human being treat another human being like subhuman garbage because they felt the person they were mistreating was standing in the way of some greater good, some greater goal with good intentions behind it. If you did ever see something like that, did you find it ironic that someone whose words say they want to help also has the ability to verbally lash and degrade anyone who doesn't see their cause as the single most important crusade of their life? I kind of think it's a little self-defeating in their argument structure, maybe. Hurting people so they can help people. What do you think? Richard and Kahlan enjoy a meal of bread and sausage, washed down with rainwater collected from the tarp of their shelter. Kahlan asks Richard if he thinks the thing that stood behind the boundary wall was really her sister. He says no. He thinks they're able to conjure people that the person wants to see and use their close relationship with them to draw them into the boundary. So it's an illusion, is what Richard says. It's all an illusion. And symbolically, there's something to be said for that. Have you ever heard the phrase, "my parents believe," or "I was raised to believe"? And if you have you ever known someone to simply accept those teachings without ever really looking any deeper than what their parents told them was true? Richard tells Kahlan it seems strange that the thing from the boundary was able to hit Zed, Chase, and Kahlan so easily, but wasn't able to find Richard. Kahlan says she found that odd as well, but says it looked like the creature was attacking him blindly. For a moment, Richard thinks it might have been the sword of truth, but he quickly convinces himself that doesn't make any sense. The thing in the boundary didn't behave as though it was afraid of him, it just didn't know where he was. He also realizes that there was no pain after he cut down the thing in the boundary, and Zed told him if he ever killed someone with the sword, there was going to be pain. Richard thinks maybe it's all in his head, and none of it's real. But he takes that back when he sees Chase and Zed lying in front of him unconscious. When it comes to the feelings of trauma, we have an intense situation where the essence of who we are is injured. This moment is as close to Goodkind ever gets to talking directly to the reader in this chapter. The translation between the symbolism and the story is a bit complex, though. In the story, Richard says, maybe it was all in his head and none of it's real, as one complete sentence. The story Richard is playing, Richard is saying, what if he had imagined the whole thing? The other meaning behind those words is a direct statement of fact to the reader when they are feeling mentally hurt. Maybe it's all in your head. Maybe none of it's real. Which sounds outwardly cruel if you stop reading right there. That's why the next sentence is so important to the translation in the symbolism. Richard thinks that can't be it. It was real enough to strike down his friends. In the story, Goodkind uses the same phrase, "that can't be it," to describe two separate things at the same time using the same logical structure. Richard is given information by his senses which contradicts what he's thinking about. He uses that information to decide his thoughts are lying to him. When Richard feels like it was all in his head, he uses his reason to figure out that it must be real and overrides the lie he's telling himself about it not being real. Symbolically, the phrase, "that can't be it," is the lie we tell ourselves when we ask ourselves where the true source of our mental pain comes from. It's the same evidence, presented in the same way, but the only difference is physically in the story, it means the evidence isn't enough to make Richard believe a comforting lie. When someone says your pain comes from within and is a choice to hold on to, they arrive to this moment, this lie, and the answer is often, "that can't be it," followed by the evidence of the senses about how much the pain hurts and how uncontrollable it is. But the only evidence being used to defend this is that the pain exists. No one is arguing the pain doesn't exist. That information is accepted by everyone. The argument is against the source of the pain. Goodkind is saying that when we want to believe the source of the pain is not the choices we make about what situations remove our freedom to decide how we feel about them, in that moment, we convince ourselves to act that way forever, saying, "that can't be true." Once the mind reaches the decision something is impossible, that's as far as the road goes. And unfortunately, on the other side of this mental exercise is the solution to the problem that you're thinking about, but you stopped at the point that can't be true. Well, what if it is? What's it gonna hurt to think about what if it could be true? Words they can't hurt you. They don't have knives or guns. They can only make you consider something that you hadn't thought of. You don't have to stay there. You don't have to agree, but you have the mental capacity to explore. And at the very least, understand where a person who disagrees with you is coming from, making communicating your point of view a lot more effective. So there's a selfish reason to do that. And I can tell you from personal experience with depression, anxiety, and a number of other things that it's not the right solution in terms of how it makes you feel when you try doing it. It feels like the wrong thing to do. It feels impossible. It feels like a lot of things. But if you can use your reason to say, I've been spending the last 30 years taking pills, trying to feel better, self-medicate, and none of that's been working, what have I really got to lose at this point? And when I finally got to that point, they call it hitting rock bottom in other places, that's when you start to see maybe there is a different way. And that's all I'm saying. So if you understand that, you understand the symbolism that good kind is trying to make. You do. It's not more complicated than that. So all this is symbolically, it's a warning against becoming the slave to your own instincts and emotions, which get tied to those instincts. But in both cases, the advice is the same. Don't let fight or flight reactions take that which feels uncomfortable to override the ability to look at a situation from an unbiased perspective, and then make the best decision on what we know is true instead of what we believe might be true. Both of them finish their meal of bread and sausage, and Richard removes an apple from his backpack for the both of them to share, reducing the total number of apples estimated to be inside Richard's backpack to 197. Richard asks Kahlan if she is tired, and she responds by mentioning that she is sore in places she cannot mention. She asks him what he knows about South Haven, and he says it's one of those towns where you don't feel safe inside it because the people inside that town have a habit of stealing things and making violence. Kahlan gives Richard the business when she makes sure that he can agree to leave them behind if he has to. And Richard thinks about this for a minute and describes what he thinks Kahlan is feeling. She hungers to stop Dark and Rawl. She would stop at nothing. And she wants to know that he has the ability to go on at any cost. And that's what's bothering her. So he really makes sure he tries to understand that. Symbolically, this tracks with Kahlan's personification of justice. The sense of justice within ourselves is a very point and click. Once it has direction, it is not easily deterred. Frequently, our own sense of justice asks us to fight and go on, to sacrifice and suffer for the greater good of our chosen cause. Our sense of justice is what drives us through the pain and heartache as we struggle to do good in the world. But all too easily, our sense of justice can lead us to ignore any pain or cost without telling us if that cause is good or even worth it. And Richard, as the symbol for integrity, means it's up to us to decide what is and isn't worth it. Richard says to Kahlan, "Look at me. Look at me. I am the seeker now. I will do whatever it takes to stop Dark and Rawl, even if it means leaving my friends in the care of someone while we go on. But I won't make that choice unless I absolutely have no other option," which is excellent foreshadowing for chapter 15 when they have no other option but to leave them with 80, the bone woman. Richard offers to take watch, but Kahlan says the snakes and the hearthounds would make it impossible for her to sleep. He says if she doesn't want to sleep, she can help him make a litter for Zed and Chase. While Chase is unconscious, he takes another one of his weapons and uses it to cut wood instead of cutting up enemies. Richard is pleased that Chase would outwardly show his disapproval if he were conscious enough to know what was going on. After telling himself a comforting lie, Richard takes a moment to wonder how he will feel if Chase and Zed don't get better, and he settles on what most of us do when we're faced with the health problems of a loved one. We cling to hope and bet everything on they just have to get better and that's that. Or maybe it's their time to go. This is tricky for some of us to think about, but the easiest way to understand where Richard is coming from is to ask yourself if you can think of someone who falls apart when the death of a loved one is even mentioned. I've seen this conversation trigger a strong flight response in some of the most perfectly reasonable and rational individuals I've ever known. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That's a human thing. It's a normal thing. The veil of death is a common place for the boundary to be drawn inside a rational mind, and the fight and flight instinct created anytime we need to reconcile information we know to be true with information we believe to be true. Eventually, that person is the first to go. The death of friends and loved ones is an inevitable part of life. And since it's impossible so far to fight death and win, running away from it seems to be the only choice available to some, and they take it. Neither one of them wants to sleep, but both of them are very tired. They settle for sitting next to each other. In a romantic, candlelit moment, Kahlan gives every man reading hope that an incredibly specific combination of extenuating circumstances can lead a beautiful woman to cozy up next to them and take a nap on their shoulder. While at the same time, Richard gives every woman reading hope that in an equally, incredibly specific combination of extenuating circumstances, the handsome man with rippling six-pack abs and a chiseled chin made from solid granite will cozy up next to them and keep the monsters away while they sleep, especially when he wakes her up when she's having a bad dream. Richard takes the opportunity to pull the old "let me put my arms around you and pull you close because you had a nightmare" move on Kahlan, and it works. She falls back asleep, and Richard touches the tooth his father gave him as he watches the Hardhounds. Romantically, this scene is a pretty good one. Symbolically, this scene is a pretty great one. If we continue to use Richard as the personification of integrity, and Kahlan as the symbol for justice, then it makes perfect sense that integrity would seek to protect its own sense of justice. The hounds represent an attack made against our free will, attempting to rip our heart out and make us choose to act as though we had no free will, making us functionally dead. We may be alive, but our choices are no longer our own, and the ability to choose is the most important part of what makes us human. The relationship between justice and integrity is why love between Richard and Kahlan is so strong. One without the other is weak and ineffective and doomed to fail. One way to understand this relationship within a person is to ask yourself if you ever saw a person who stood up against another person without anger or fear and simply told someone they would not participate in an action or activity because it was wrong, even when they had something to lose by not going along with what was asked of them. Have you ever been that person? For justice to be effective instead of self-destructive, integrity of the self and the truth is required regardless of how many different lies a person is told to try and make them compromise what they know is right. Kahlan convinces Richard to get some sleep, and when he wakes up, there's a tin cup of hot tea waiting for him. Kahlan is impressed by Kahlan's ability to use the only readily available source of heat to make water hot, as they both enjoy a sugary breakfast of dried fruit. Richard checks on Zed and Chase and finds out that Zed is breathing slower, his heart is beating normal, but his skin is cold and clammy. Even though Kahlan is afraid of the snakes, they both decide to haul ass to South Haven, but because they have so much stuff, they have to make 2 trips to get across the water. Richard narrates that he won't be able to use the litters to drag their friends until they reach a better road, and is forced to wait an entire sentence before the author introduces him to the better road. The litter does its job, they make it to South Haven, which is described as a collection of ramshackle, it's fun to say, ramshackle buildings placed along the forest and a beach. The buildings are in poor repair, and the streets are even more littered with trash and garbage than any major American city the general public is told isn't really that bad unless you start to statistically compare it to other places. Richard sees the inn and starts heading right for it. He tells Kahlan to be careful because the men here are dangerous, and Kahlan says, "No prob, fam. These people are the crew I run with, what?" Her response makes little sense to Richard, but he chooses not to ask what she means. Once they both enter the door, low-key Western-style music starts playing as all of the talking trails off. Richard gives the room a slow scan like Gordon Ramsay doing a restaurant review as he begins listing everything which needs improvement. What is all of this smoke? What is it? The 1940s? Fuck me. And look at this. Are those supposed to be tables? Because they look like piles of shit to me. I would pull up a board and sit down, but there aren't even any bloody chairs. Just benches. Bloody fucking benches. This floor is a sticky mess, so at least all the roaches are eating well. I mean, I don't get it. How could a place this dirty have any customers at all? The stairs have no handrail, and the whole mess smells like a tube gym sock dipped in leathery burnt chicken. Bloody hell. Richard notices the patrons of the inn look a bit too pleased to say Kahlan, crooked, toothless smiles and all. The innkeeper is described as a short, bald man wearing a wife beater and something described as an apron which could have never been white. Interestingly enough, we never learn what the true color of this apron was. It seems to be implied that the apron used to be white and is supposed to be white, but the only words the author uses to describe it is in an apron that looked like it could have never been white. One could say the same about a blue apron or a red one. Richard notices the innkeeper seems to be the only one in the room besides him who is able to keep from undressing Kahlan with their eyes. Richard takes this as a sign that the man shouldn't be judged as harshly as the company he makes a living off of, and he trusts him with the information that could put Kahlan in danger. The man folds his arms and says he doesn't want any trouble. The innkeeper knows what sort of customers he has, and Richard looks like he's going to be far more trouble than it's worth. The man said he's just trying to live his life here, and Richard says with menace that he doesn't want any trouble either. Don't you get me started. In 2015, PsychMechanics.com released a clumsily titled article written by Herman Parvez called Body Language, Crossing Arms, Meaning. He writes, when a person feels threatened by a situation, they cross their arms over their chest, creating a barrier that helps them protect their vital organs. Also, when a person finds themselves in an undesirable situation, you'll find them folding their arms. And when he says that it looks like Richard's going to be more trouble than he's worth, he is 100% correct in this. Before they leave the city, this honest, dirty, bald-headed man, his inn is even worse shambles than it was before he got here. And the inside of the building becomes the scene of a multiple homicide and a hanging. The innkeeper sees the sword on Richard's hip, and it's implied that he is aware what it means and what a seeker of truth is. He looks into Richard's eyes to take a measure of him, and for reasons which are never fully explained, he agrees to let them stay by asking how many rooms he needs. Not wanting to press his luck, he says one will be enough. A big guy stands up, dripping with booze, and his hand on the handle of a knife. He says Kahlan is a good-looking woman of negotiable affection, and he wants Richard to share. The big drunk man says Kahlan's a whore, and I'll be sleeping with her along with everyone else in this room, or there will be trouble. Richard, filled with feelings of defensiveness, rage, lethal intent, and jealousy, has all of his instincts telling him there is only one solution to this problem. He needs to kill every person in the room. Kahlan isn't currently acting under the decision that there's only one solution to this problem, and she stops Richard from killing anyone and says, she isn't a whore in this situation, Richard is. Richard Pfeiffer, heartland, heartthrob, gigolo, ready and willing to serve as your guide to sexy time. Kahlan pulls the old I'm an overworked and underappreciated important woman who finds it easier to trade money for favors of the flesh. To make her point, she gives Richard a high five on his butt cheek. And it works. The men break out in laughter, and no one has to kill anyone. The innkeeper thanks Kahlan for trying something before the mass murder and tells everyone what a shame it would be if his only real possession of value in this petri dish of health code violations, which also doubles as a meeting place for a group of rapists, it would just be awful if anything bad were to happen to that. This tense scene serves a dual purpose. The first is to create some underlying tension for later when things go to hell. The second purpose is another illustration of how quick and easy it is to willingly choose to act as though a person has no free will anymore. Richard is angry beyond angry. And we've already established in earlier chapters that anger by itself is neither good nor bad. It just is. And it is up to the person using that anger to give it meaning. Richard's anger and jealousy become so intense that he forgets he's still in full control of his body and his decision-making. No magic has been used on him to take away his autonomy. All he has done is switch his focus from thinking about the situation around him to thinking about 100 different reasons why his feelings must be correct, using the strength of those feelings as his only evidence. The moment Richard chooses to justify his position that a lot of people are going to die is the moment Richard gives up his ability to think rationally. Luckily, Kahlan isn't burdened by such powerful emotion or jealousy, and she is thinking clearly. Instead of worrying about what a bunch of toothless, slack-jawed yokels think, she knows that the red-haired man cares a lot more about asserting his dominance over Richard and taking what is his. But in his mind, his should belong to everyone. So the man thinks that this woman belongs to everyone, and that he is interested in actually having sex with Kahlan to prove that she should belong to him much more than he is interested in having sex with Kahlan just for fun. I'm sure that makes the top 10 list of his reasons, but if this weren't true, then there's no reason Kahlan's strategy would work if it wasn't true. Richard no longer appears elevated above them by Kahlan's presence. Therefore, the source of the red-haired man's grief, his cognitive dissonance, his feeling is that compared to this man, I don't look as fancy. It must be because he thinks he's better than me. Since that's the only reason he can think of, he doesn't like having that comparison made because it forces the uncomfortable exercising of thinking why this man would feel this way. And he spends his time coming up with reasons of why he's feeling right about that. He decides Richard really isn't better than him, and he can prove it by taking his fancy woman without his permission. Kahlan sees the problem of approaching this from a mile away, and it's the heart of the wizard's 13th rule she uses to know how she needs to act, and she knows she needs to do this quickly. The heart of the wizard's 13th rule is we cannot change the nature of humanity by force, violence, or imprisonment. It is our reason and rational mind which knows this. Our feelings don't care about this, especially when those feelings present strongly or are never examined by reason after they're experienced. Richard feels like he is right, and nothing will change his mind. The red-haired man feels he is right, and nothing will change his mind. Both of them have decided the only path to resolution is this, but since neither of them have agreed to anything, all they're going to do is clash until there is bloodshed or worse. This repeated digging in and ignoring the wizard's 13th rule by trying to change another person's mind by force or violence will be referred to in this series as the conservation of cognitive dissonance, a term pulled from the field of cognitive physics. For the many viewers who fell asleep during high school physics class, the only word you need to know is conservation. In nature, conservation means to save something. In physics, the term conservation means something a little different. All it means is that energy isn't created or destroyed, it just changes form sometimes. That's all it means. Energy equals E equals mc squared. Things just transform. They don't appear or go away. When two ping pong balls roll into each other, they bounce off of each other. That's the conservation of energy. This situation is like two ping pong balls rolling toward each other. The red-haired man ping pong ball and a Richard ping pong ball. No matter how angry Richard gets or how violent the red-haired man gets, since both of them are reacting and coming from a place where feelings make the decisions first, then the mind has to sort out why those feelings aren't wrong. That's the dissonance. Their instinct in this instance is to fight, and it will never be overcome by fighting. They will always get back the same amount of bad feelings that they put into the system, because they only see one option. They have created a real-life trolley dilemma. Only this time, Kahlan is at the lever, and she's smart enough to know this isn't about her. It's about the red-haired man's pride, and she takes away the things which made her interesting to him. Richard only saw one option in front of him because he was using his mind to think of reasons why his feelings were right, and he was blind to the option Kahlan saw. Kahlan saves Richard from having to kill people and keeps this shiny-headed, dirty man's prized business safe for a few more pages at least. If I had to pull an example from contemporary pop culture to explain this, I would say the most easily understood example would be stand-up comedy and self-deprecating humor. Amelia Bell of Virginia Commonwealth University wrote a short paper on the topic, and under her section of the psychological effectiveness of self-deprecating humor, she writes, the audience is less threatened by self-deprecating humor because it is solely directed at the comedian. Kahlan does this by directing the butt of the joke on herself as a busy and randy, important businesswoman, and at Richard's butt when she treats him like a hapless buffoon. She goes on to say the comedian creates an emotional and psychological connection with the audience members who've had similar situations as the comedian. That is, when Kahlan makes a joke about Richard's potential to disappoint her sexually and needing someone better suited to the task to come along. Every man in the room who has ever disappointed with a woman, whether it was his fault or theirs, can empathize with her situation because it's one they have gone through themselves, at least from their own perspective. The comedian's use of ethos and pathos retain the audience's attention and participation. Kahlan has full command of the room, and while she's giving her performance, she ends the interaction with a choice to the audience, and this choice is where the magic happens. When the moment of consent is requested rather than demanded, because the comedian is willing to relinquish a certain amount of power to the audience, there's always a chance of success where demands of consent have failed before. Chris Farley was a master of self-deprecating humor and would often make fun of himself, his weight, his intelligence, and poor life choices. One of his best-known bits was Matt Foley, motivational speaker. All right, everybody, how's it going? Good. Now, as your father probably told you, my name is Matt Foley, and I am a motivational speaker. Now, let me get this started by giving you a little bit of a scenario of what my life is all about. First off, I am 35 years old, I am divorced, and I live in a van down by the river. Now, you kids are probably saying to yourself, I'm going to go out and I'm going to get the world by the tail and wrap it around and put it in my pocket. Well, I'm here to tell you, you're probably going to find out as you go there that you're not going to amount to jack squat. You're going to end up eating a steady diet of government cheese and living in a van down by the river. Now, young man, what do you want to do with your life? And he's lovable because he puts it out there for everyone to see that the world isn't as nice for us as we pretend it is when someone asks. He's willing to be vulnerable and honest. And as a result, people are drawn to the sincerity that's wrapped up inside his humor. I would say this is a pretty good comparison because Kahlan ends her set with the entire audience laughing. And it's far more impressive to get a group of people who are set on raping and killing to do that than it is to get a group of people who paid money with the expectation of someone trying to make them laugh. If Kahlan didn't already have one impossible job, then a career in stand-up might be the right one for her. The innkeeper tells Richard and Kahlan to head upstairs. He knows his customers well enough to know that they would show some aggression towards any sign of compassion and would see their injured comrades as a weakness, which would undermine Kahlan's "we're really no better than you are, so don't worry about us" strategy that she used just a moment ago. Richard isn't so sure about trusting the innkeeper with the lives of his friends. He doesn't like the idea. And both of those things are true at the same time. Richard doesn't like the idea. Those men would see them caring for the injured as an invitation to attack. The innkeeper, of all people, pulls the wizard's second rule and tells Richard his good intentions would put their friends in more danger than they already are. The man finally introduces himself as Bill, and Richard tries to figure out what to do by looking at Kahlan. Her face is still unreadable to him, so he looks at Bill instead. Richard sees a tough guy who's been through a lot, and also feels like he's looking at someone who is telling the truth about their good intentions. Richard agrees to take Bill's advice and goes upstairs with Kahlan. Once they arrive in the room, they're met with accommodations which appear to belong to the type of building they are inside. It contains the bare minimum of furniture, smells awful, and given the state of the spit-covered wall, as a reader, I am surprised to hear how easily Kahlan decides to sit down on the bed. Because of the semen. I'm saying that in an inn full of thieves and rapists, they would care little about spilling semen on the bed and not cleaning it up. I'm saying that the sheets probably make a crackling noise as certain bonds holding the fabric into a rigid shape are broken. Richard is mad at Kahlan and tells her she can't believe that she just did that in front of everybody. How could she say such a thing? Shocking. Shocking, isn't it? Kahlan tells Richard he's not seeing the big picture, and by focusing on what people would just as soon do to him, by focusing on people who would just as soon see him dead and lying in a ditch, he's putting his life in danger by caring about what those people think for no good reason. She says she would do anything, and I do mean anything, to protect him, even if it means giving him an unannounced butt-cheek high five in front of a room full of people. Richard is trying to find the perfect combination of words to express how angry he was at those men. Because even though the situation is resolved, he's still trapped inside his singular view that the solution he had chosen was the only one available. Richard is experiencing a paradox right now. He was convinced there was only one option before. All of his feelings told him that was the truth, and he believed them. And he used his rational mind to come up with reasons why he was right and why everything which seems to go against that was wrong. Even though right now he has new evidence in front of him which clearly says he was wrong about his number of choices, he still is looking for reasons why the reality in front of him isn't legitimate. As if the method of solution somehow does or doesn't count after the fact based on an arbitrary set of guidelines. The author describes this when he goes through Richard's processing of his emotions. Notice how words that describe logic and reason are notably absent. He was angry beyond words. He was at the brink of lethal commitment. He was one wrong word away from violence. Pulling away from that commitment to violence was agonizing. He still felt a lust for violence. If you look at the symbolism from 2 chapters ago, Kahlan, as a symbol for justice, was led to be caught up in the same type of situation. When our sense of justice is misused to reduce the number of choices we have for how we feel we can respond to something from infinity down to 1 or 2 choices, we lose control of our rational mind and lose the ability to make choices which are not self-destructive. That doesn't cancel out all the good intentions behind those choices or the conviction people place behind them. It's simply a recognition of the cause and effect relationships which happen after choices are made. It's a lot more likely that a good outcome will be found when the number of possible solutions is large, especially if the situation is tricky. So in chapter 13, we're shown how a sense of justice can get a person into trouble and how our integrity can help protect ourselves against that. In chapter 15, we're shown how our sense of integrity can get us into trouble and how our sense of justice can be used to get us out of that. One way to understand this is to ask yourself, if you've ever witnessed someone behave irrationally by being mislabeled by another human being, that person knows who they are, and they know whatever facts they have learned about themselves throughout the course of their lives. If all that is true, and it is, then how does another person gain the power to make them so angry just by using words which they don't feel accurately describe what they see? The short answer is the same as many other answers surrounding why people get upset over each other. Integrity is the sense of self. When information is presented which is in contradiction to what a person thinks they are best defined as, it produces cognitive dissonance, which is a moment of choice inside the mind that one thing is being compared to another, and you have to decide which thing is the right thing. The comparison prompts a distinction to be made about what is right and what is not right. In this example, the two things being compared are what a person believes to be true about themselves and what another person believes to be true about what they're observing. At the moment a decision is made is usually based on this comparison. The person asks themselves what they know, if what they know is true, and rejects that which they know is not true, which is all well and good when the information only stays within the mind. When information is used with the intent of changing another person's mind, we come back to the Wizard's 13th rule, which says the nature of humanity can't be changed by violence, threats, or imprisonment. And if someone else is presenting the information, regardless of how forceful and passionate their argument is, they won't succeed in changing a single mind by expressing themselves that way. All they do is put information out there, which creates a paradox for the person they're talking to. That person makes their own decision, as we all do, about what that information means, and they decide what is right because they're the one who has control of that decision. That's the conservation of cognitive dissonance. They both disagree on facts, and neither of them tries to understand what deeper feeling is motivating their own decision-making process. And usually an inner perspective of that decision-making process usually goes no deeper than, because I know it's right. All of that is fine when a person is making decisions which guide their own lives. But when trying to persuade another person, that isn't enough to make a difference. And that's where the blindness comes into play. Feeling right and thinking they are right means being right to many people, making them blind to every option which is not rooted in direct engagement, which is not rooted in a direct agreement with them. It turns into fighting or running. And that is what Richard gets trapped in this chapter. Most readers will look at this section and decide that Richard is not wrong in how he feels. Kahlan isn't the type of person who would hire a prostitute, nor are those men right to desire to have her in that way over his dead body, if necessary. They're not right either. Richard knows that. And so do all of the readers. The ability to see the third option is the gateway to making better life choices. And that is why the Wizard's 8th rule is so critical to everything. Without the Wizard's 8th rule, deserve victory, we are at the mercy of what others would tell us is and isn't okay to do with our lives and our choices. Who are we to know for sure? Because the hidden trap which catches us is we do it to ourselves. We get most of it right. We see a situation which is wrong and we know it's wrong. We also know that we can't change a person's mind by force, only with their own agreement, but we don't apply that same wisdom to ourselves. If we truly knew and believed what we did, then it doesn't change a single thing in our lives if other people agree or disagree with us. And a few people would say, it really does matter, and those people are already trapped, and it's their fault. They've given up on all the solutions which might allow them to see the opinions of fools should have no power over their lives. And they invite foolishness into themselves regularly in an attempt to overpower it by force, hurting only themselves in the process. That is what Richard does when he is downstairs and is ready to kill those men. Richard knows it's wrong what they're doing, but that isn't enough for him. He needs them to know that he thinks it's wrong, and they will either agree with him or become dead, so they're no longer capable of disagreeing with him. Which, by the way, is a violation of the wizard's 12th rule, which states you can destroy those who speak the truth, but not the truth itself. In this case, the truth would be that Richard is unable to change their minds by force of his will and threats of violence, or even with the execution of violence. Making them dead does nothing to change this fact. They're no longer alive to hold that point of view, but violence never changed their point of view. It only changed their ability to express it. For those who understand the Wizard's 8 rule, the words of other people cease to be threatening and become a source of information instead, even when those words are at odds with what a person believes. It's a false connection we create which gives legitimacy to our own thoughts and ideas when other people say those thoughts and ideas are good. It's a false connection we create when someone says our thoughts and ideas are bad. Those words have nothing to do with what is actually true. They might be true, but that doesn't mean they'll always be true or that they can influence what the truth is. Those words can only see the truth or not see it. What is actually true never changes. When Richard creates a connection between what these men think and what he knows, that's the moment his integrity becomes compromised and weaponized against itself. Richard is no longer capable of reason when using his own integrity as the only measure of what is and isn't right. That's why Kahlan is so important in the symbolism of these novels. As much as justice can't remain uncorrupted without integrity, it's also true that integrity cannot remain uncorrupted without justice. Both Kahlan and justice in this series are described as sources of incredible strength and drive. They have the ability to forge ahead without fear. Integrity does not have that ability to forge ahead without fear. Integrity can only maintain its own shape and resist any self-destructive changes which might try and make a person go against their personal code of conduct. When integrity is challenged, the same way Richard's health and reputation were challenged, integrity is not the tool to save the day in that instance. Integrity is the ability to stay put, and it was used in chapter 13 to keep justice where it belonged, forcing it to stay put. When integrity is challenged, it is justice that must step in and move integrity out of the way. When staying put and digging in turns out to be a self-destructive course of action. Practically, it boils down to a question which pops up in many relationships. What's more important, getting what you want or wanting the other person to say you're right? That's exactly what Kahlan is talking about when she said Richard needs to keep his head in the game and focus on stopping Dark and Rawl instead of focusing on what a bunch of drunk criminals think of his or Kahlan's honor. He wanted them to think he was right, or at least make it impossible for them to disagree with him by killing them, and Kahlan was focused on saving everyone and staying as safe as possible in the meantime. After Kahlan makes it perfectly clear that he was letting his emotions do his thinking for him, Richard realizes she is right and agrees with her. Also, notice the author's attention to detail when it comes to the resolution of Richard's problem here. Richard was hurting himself by ignoring every possibility which did not end in bloodshed because his feelings were signaling to him at every turn that there was no alternative. So every moment where bloodshed wasn't the answer was a moment of emotional pain for Richard, which the author takes great lengths to spell out as a deep, sweeping, and powerful force. The moment of decision for Richard is when he listens to her and sees the logic which he chooses to follow instead of his own feelings. Well, that anger was powerful enough to make Richard want to kill an entire room full of people. His ability to choose to follow his anger is so much stronger that all he needs to do to dismiss his attachment is to call on that action which he has in control of and let it go. And he does so by letting out a breath. That's the way the author does that moment. He has released the thing which is causing him pain. That breath is an expression of relief. Factually, nothing has changed. Those men are still who they are and did what they did. The only difference is Richard has taken ownership of how he will respond to those facts. He may still have to deal with the consequences of those facts, but having extreme situations which prompt extreme emotions does not remove the ability of a person to choose how to respond. It only makes it more difficult for those who have chosen to act as though their emotions and instincts are the source of power in their decision-making process to ask themselves, is what they feel right, or is it also what they think is right? This goes back earlier in the chapter where Richard wonders if the thing from the boundary was even real or if it was in his head. In this situation, the pain Richard felt was real, as was his anger and desire to kill, but it was also all in his head. Once Kahlan gave him new thoughts which don't change a single thing about their situation, Richard is able to see a whole new perspective as well as a lot of other options he was blind to before. The way I understand this in the real world is to think about times when someone was angry, but was still capable of reason and someone else was able to calm them down with their words. Can you think of a tense situation in your life where a person who was worked up went from feeling completely out of control to feeling much better about things when the only change in their life was a combination of words and sentences given to them by someone else? Did their pain look real before they let go of it? If all of that wasn't inside their own head, then where was it? And how were they able to let it go? Richard lets out a breath and lets out the anger with it. He agrees with Kahlan and apologizes for almost causing a lot of trouble with very little to gain from it. Oh no, my page. Coming soon, turning the page. Kahlan rewards Richard's apology with a long hug, which is interrupted by Bill knocking on the door and bringing up two of his injured friends. While this is happening, the innkeeper's son sees Kahlan and instantly falls hopelessly in love, which Richard understands when it happens to him, but doesn't appreciate when someone else does it. Bill says he knows Chase and that the boundary warden stays here sometimes. He also says that the people downstairs wouldn't take the news very well if they found out he was staying here. It would tear him apart. If you look at the source of the disagreement with the men downstairs earlier as a problem with Richard making them look bad by comparison, instead of as a desire to bed Kahlan over Richard's dead body, then it makes perfect sense why the group of men would not like Chase either. His very existence forces a comparison which does not leave those men looking favorable. And this is another point the author is trying to make with his symbolism here. Have you ever seen someone who was suffering the consequences of their own poor life choices express anger or disgust at someone else who was hardworking or successful? There is no shortage of reasons those individuals will come up with to explain why that person is wasting their time or has somehow managed to succeed through any means other than the result of the consequences of their choices. The only answer that is not allowed is that person took ownership of their life and using the same amount of time everyone else has in the day, made something better for themselves that they hadn't done at the beginning of the day. That is the one answer that will get you banned from Facebook pages, get you laughed out of any group with the word justice attached to it, and is a fast way to make enemies of those who don't see the relationship between choice and outcome. All they see is a lack of choice, and the mere act of pointing out choices is enough to draw their anger and scorn. I've seen it all. People mocking professional athletes without an ounce of the work ethic it would take to get where those people have gotten. People making fun of fat people at the gym when a pint of vodka every couple of days is barely enough to keep the shakes away. I've seen people get very, very angry when I've told them how I finally won my battle against depression, anxiety, and child abuse. The minute the words left my mouth that I was in control of my life and had the ability to use my choices to better myself in a way that left me feeling completely unburdened by depression, anxiety, and the effects of my childhood abuse, I am told that is impossible and there is something wrong with me for saying it. The symbolism here is very clear. Goodkind is spelling out the relationship between those who believe self-reliance and choice is a path to a better life, and those who believe a better life is impossible, and because the choices we have aren't the choices we want, or the choices that other people have, then there may as well not be any choices at all. Richard tells Bill those men can try to give them trouble, but he makes it clear that would make him use the sword of truth, and using the sword of truth makes him angry. and they wouldn't like him when he's angry. Dun, dun, dun. Richard gives Kahlan some money and tells her to convince a young, impressionable boy to spend the night outside in the rain with their horses, telling her he's confident he will do it because if she asks him to do it, he will listen. Personally, I've always liked the part of the chapter when Bill tells his son, "Don't forget to bring a towel," and then immediately adds to make sure that it's one of the good towels. I was always curious what the towels he brought looked like, but the author leaves that completely up to the reader's imagination. They aren't referenced as being filthy, but to me, the smallest details are the ones that are the most interesting. What does a clean towel look like to Bill? Is it the one that's only slightly stained, but just a tiny bit? Has it gone from white to off-white over time, but still looks relatively good? Perhaps it's a brand new and pristine towel from a surplus of supplies kept in stock for his business. Or maybe it's from the general goods store he also runs in addition to the inn. We are never given that information and must make do on what we have. Since it is my choice, I've chosen to imagine a mostly clean towel which looks to have been washed and cared for, but is slightly discolored from frequent use with one or two specks, only slightly larger than the head of a pin, stained in one of the corners. Given the care of the rest of Bill's linens, I feel this would most accurately fit what he would consider a clean towel to be. Bill tells Richard and Kahlan that while there is no healer, there might be someone nearby who would be able to help them. He tells them about 80 the bone woman and says she's only a few hours away. He also says the people who stay at his inn are superstitious and won't go near the place because she lives near the boundary. He also says he can't prove it, but rumor has it people she doesn't like also have a habit of dropping dead. Richard asks why Bill is helping them, and he said Chase is a friend of his, and the boundary wardens are good for business. Richard decides that since he's going somewhere to ask someone for something, he shouldn't show up empty-handed. He asks Bill to put together some supplies, and Bill the Council of Heartland. Bill says if it's for official business, then he'll be reimbursed, and then complains about his high tax rate. And don't even get me started on taxes. Kahlan gives Randy a silver coin and tells him all of the horses belong to her and that keeping those horses safe is the only thing standing between her and a terrible death. Randy is eager to help and runs off. Aside from being a love-struck teenager named Randy, I found this particular interaction between him and Kahlan to be consistent with the relationship many young people have with justice. While everyone is vulnerable to a hijacking of their good intentions from those claiming to serve a greater good with their calls for sacrifice and service, children are especially vulnerable because they don't have the benefit experience telling them that not everyone claiming to be motivated by doing the right thing is telling the truth. Television shows with politically charged messages, groups organizing people who desire to do good, passionate speeches written by adults delivered by children to be heard by children are all things which appeal to the young person's sense of justice. Much like in Chapter 14, the pull is strong, and it is their own sense of self. If it's not firmly developed, then integrity ends up low on the list of things which deserve to be protected, and the cause becomes more important than anything else. The easiest way to understand this idea is, have you ever seen a young person be very passionate about something and care very much about it genuinely, but when asked to explain what they actually stood for, the best they could do is repeat a phrase given to them by another person? If they were able to offer anything but more than passion at all. Randy is young and impressionable, and there is a symbolic meaning behind what Bill says when he jokingly asks Kahlan to say if she'll stay and marry the boy. If Kahlan were to take him up on that offer, her confessor's power would destroy his mind and make him into a mindless servant of her whims and wishes. That is exactly what the author is warning us about in this scene through the use of a little humor. The young can have their minds destroyed chasing good intentions motivated by dreams of justice. They won't even know it's happening until one day they find that they're very angry at a world which won't listen to them. Aggressive behavior towards those who require more than faith in their cause to believe them, and blind to anyone who asks them to see the world from a point of view which is different from the one they have now. The innkeeper says he'll take care of the supplies and bring them some food. Richard thanks him, and Bill says he can thank them by signing an itemized list of different things he's helping them with. Before fully committing to gather supplies and other things on Richard's word alone, Bill runs a credit check on him when he asks if anyone would recognize his signature. Richard name drops his brother Michael's new appointment to first counselor, and Bill is suddenly very worried about what's going to happen to him if Richard decides that his accommodations are not befitting a man who is the brother of another important man. In 1999, Igne Amundsen of the Michelin Institute in Norway wrote a paper titled Political Corruption, An Introduction to the Issues. Amundsen states, in a corrupt government, public office and position is seen by politicians as a personal asset, and there is no clear distinction between the public good and private domain. Because they view their authority as a personal right, and it's treated as a private resource, thus the entire political system then is characterized by a deep and thorough privatization of these public resources, meaning these politicians take what is meant for the public's good and use it for personal gain because in their mind, they are the public good. And it's okay to take what is meant for the people because really it's going to be helping the people in the long run. Politicians, to a large extent, politics is really about the distribution of resources in the form of jobs, contracts, scholarships, gifts, and other resources that are supposed to be within their care and used to make people's lives better. But once those gifts and public resources start to go into a person's friends, relatives, and political allies, the author of this paper goes on to say that develops into what he calls a kleptocracy, a stealing government, as if you were. That is, when authority is used to extract resources from the ruled, public office is used to enforce the collection of all sorts of gifts from these who will succeed or fail solely based on what decisions and policies the politician chooses to support. So the people are at the mercy of what laws these people will pass. Corruption, embezzlement, theft, and extortion are used to make private fortunes, and political power is used by power holders to enter into profitable business. Bill is worried that if Richard becomes displeased with him, he'll have the army come and cause him all sorts of trouble in the name of official state business. While we never learn for sure what type of activities the government of Westland engages in, we do have enough clues to say that the government at least has the appearance of corruption and abuse of power for personal gain. Given Michael's track record and less than honest dealings with his wealthy friends, along with his willingness to sell out his own brother to Dark and Raw, it's fair to say that the government of Westland has its share of corruption to weed out. I don't think anyone really needs to look very far to see examples of this behavior. In 2018, Wayne County, Michigan, Chuck Rizzo was sentenced to 5 years and 6 months in prison for his role in a corruption scandal. He was sentenced to 60 months to commit bribery and 6 months for wire fraud. In a plea agreement, Rizzo said he bribed local officials, including the Clinton Township trustee Dean Reynolds and Macomb Township trustee Clifford Faridas, to support contracts for Rizzo Environmental Services. He agreed to wear a wire and help federal investigators arrest corrupt public officials he bribed to support giving government contracts to his garbage hauling business. Investigators said that a government witness told them Rizzo continued to commit crimes even after he started working with feds to bust officials who voted to give them the contracts worth millions of dollars. With as often as these stories seem to come about where someone is found guilty by a juror of their peers after a preponderance of the evidence, doesn't it strike everyone else as odd that you almost never hear of elected officials suffering any real consequences of their proven bribery and corruption? If you were in Bill's situation today and you had a very important person in your house who could ruin your life or make you very wealthy with a single phone call in either direction, would you feel the way Bill felt towards Richard? Once Richard convinces Bill that he's on his side, the innkeeper tries to pull the old, well, since it all comes out in the wash anyway, what's the harm in adding a few line items to pad this invoice like everyone else already does, cha-cha-cha-cha. But Richard isn't having any of that noise and tells Bill no. Bill doesn't take it personally and tells Richard that Chase always tells him no too, and that his request was, just a test. Yeah, that's it, one big test. And you passed it too. Good job, Richard, lousy cheapskate. I will mention this more in the next chapter, but I have good reason to believe that Bill never sees one silver or gold coin from the council after Richard leaves. And since Bill has official reason to inform the council about Richard's expenditure, Michael assuredly has access to another data point of time and location to help him track his brother's movements. Richard won't lie to the government, which also means he probably doesn't cheat on his taxes either, but he does tell Bill it isn't wrong if he chooses to give him some silver for helping him out, which he does. Bill says he'll try to keep the men away from Richard and Kahlan's room, and Richard says that's good because he plans to kill anyone who tries to get inside. Bill tells Richard he thinks that would be made much better. Let's do another take. Ding. Bill tells Richard he thinks he would have made a much better first counselor than his brother because he seems to care about doing the right thing. He also adds that looking out for the public good is not how people get elected into positions of leadership. This statement is evidence that the counselor for sure, and probably Michael, are likely to have a bit of a bad reputation when it comes to thinking honestly and fairly and putting the public good at the forefront of any decisions that are made. When Bill leaves, they eat dinner together, and Kahlan apologizes to Richard for this whole record number of consecutive days where he almost gets killed thing. And Richard puts on his best, "I'm only your best friend" smile and says, all those near-death experiences are nothing to be concerned about so long as we can sit together, talk, and have hugs sometimes. And while Kahlan can see how to tell a story to make criminals and rapists think she isn't interesting, and she can see Richard almost made a mistake earlier, she still can't see why kids love the taste of Cinnamon Toast Crunch, and she also can't see why Randy was so willing to watch their horses for them. Richard reminds her that as a pretty woman, men will do things for her if she asks them nicely. They take turns keeping watch so that any forced entry will be met with force instead of a second and more personal forced entry. When it is almost time to get up and leave, Bill knocks on the door and tells them trouble has found them. It's time for the official #1 quote from Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth in Wizard's First Rule, Chapter 15. Please note that the views and opinions of what the official #1 quote from this chapter is may differ from the views and opinions expressed by you about what your #1 quote for this chapter is. In the event that your #1 quote is different from the one mentioned here, please list your candidate for #1 quote in the comments below. And the official #1 quote is when Kahlan says to Richard, "And you care what those men think?" In our next episode, Bill's premonition about having his inn damaged comes true. Richard orders an execution, and both Kahlan and Richard take a trip down the Bone Road into Bone Town, population 80. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and if you feel like you've gotten something of value from this video, please like and subscribe to this channel. If you really like it, I ask that you connect with me by connecting with others and share this link to those who you think might enjoy it as well. If those feelings aren't there yet, no worries. I invite you to come back next time and give me a chance to try and change your mind. Thank you for watching. My name is Tom, and I have been your guide. This has been Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth. Until we meet again, live well. Take care, everybody.